Welcome to the Common Sense CTO Podcast. I'm Matt Stevenson. Today's guest on the podcast is John Nolan. Now, John and I have known each other for the best part of quarter of a century. We first met when we were involved in a series of conferences around about 2000, 2001. And that was a really exciting time to be involved in software development and technology more broadly. It was the beginnings of the internet as a widely used business tool. It was the emergence of agile practices in a formalized way. Now, John's background was right in the heart of that early emergence of Agile. He was the founder of a company called Connextra, and those of you who work in the Agile space these days may have heard of the Connextra user story template. So John's business, along with a couple of his colleagues, were the people who devised the commonly used user story format of, as a role, I need something so that I can achieve an outcome. That's really commonplace now, and it was John and his team who were the pioneers of that. So we'll talk about that a little bit today, and we'll also talk about what's happened in the last couple of decades, and then we'll bring it right up to date and have a little bit of a chat about what we think AI might be doing to our industry today. So welcome, John. Nice to have you on the podcast, and it was great to reconnect recently after a hiatus of a couple of decades.
It was, yeah. No, it's good to see you, Matt. Thanks for asking me along. Always up for a conversation, as you know. And those sessions we used to do that you referred to at OT and Spa was very much like this, where people converse and do things. And I mean,
my happiest memories of those conferences were the interactivity and almost the unscheduled bits in between the sessions. You know, it was. They were fantastic. Maybe that's a conversation for another day to reminisce. I suspect there'll be fewer people interested in that than in some of the other stuff. So, So let's make a start then. I mean, let's go right back to the beginning. You know, you were the founder, a co-founder of Connextra, and Connextra was a big driving force in the UK, particularly in the Agile movement. So what are your earliest recollections of all of that, and where did Connextra spring from? What did you think wasn't quite right that made you want to do some of those different things around user stories, for example?
Oh, that's an interesting question, yeah. So, let's give the potted history of Connextra. So I was one of the founders, so Peter Marks and David King-Lassman were the other two. And I'd known Peter Marks, he's also a technologist, he's like us, I think you know Peter as well. Yeah. And he and I had known each other from the BCS OT conferences. And Peter and David had a business before together in education. So what happened was I'd been in the States and I'd come back from working over there. And I was an old Smalltalk programmer, as you were, and I knew Kent Beck very well. So Kent Beck was a Smalltalk programmer, and he and the C4 guys were talking about this extreme programming thing. And actually at OT 1998, I spent a long time with him and Paul Dyson, actually, just going through it and talking about it and thinking about it. And it just became obvious to me that this made sense. This agile thing actually made a lot of sense, because what we were in at that time was when you were trying to develop systems, there was often quite a big design up front kind of approach. People were trying to organize the work. And, you know, if you were good at designing and thinking and making things happen, you kept getting dragged into that and away from the code. And that just didn't sit right with me and other people who were hands-on.
And I'm glad you mentioned OT 98, actually, because that's the conference I wasn't at. My first one was the year after. But a colleague of mine was there, and he saw Kent Beck do his keynote that year. And when he came back into our business talking about XP, that's when we first got excited about it and brought it into the business we were at the time. So I'm glad my recollection of that timeline is about right, because it's a long time ago.
It's about right, yeah. I mean, I'd been talking to Kent before, because he was at one of the Oops Labs. There was some conversations going on about this. It was sort of the late, I'd stopped going to Oops Labs. So it had been around. And actually, Smalltalkers were these, were very reactive and unusual developers, insofar as it was a tool that was well outside the norm, and it wasn't compiled, it was interactive, it had interactive debugging, so it was a very different basis. So we tended to think differently about how software should be developed. And I'd come back from the States, and I was wanting to do something in the internet space, because the internet had blown up. I'd been a chief architect of an e-commerce company called Interworld, and that was very early on. That was like 1996, and we were doing stuff in the internet, and I knew there was lots to be done. So, as you were saying, the traction was there. And in talking to Pete Pete Marks at OT98, funnily enough, he and I also were interested in the XP stuff, and then we went towards the product stuff. And our idea was very much thinking about bringing information together in a context, so real-time context. So if you're browsing the internet, instead of just having, the content people are giving you on a given page, could you write something that would bring in context from search engines at that time? So the digital souk, because I was getting very unhappy about what we now call bubbles, digital bubbles. And I remember having an argument with a CTO from a very large organization where he was like, a newspaper for one is a fabulous thing because it brings what you want together. And my instinct was, that's not a good thing because you're not seeing opposite views. You're not seeing, so my instinct, I couldn't name it, but my instinct was, this isn't good. And Pete and David had similar kind of, instincts, like, actually, could we do it? So we decided to set up Connextra. So it was just the three of us. And Pete and I agreed that we should do it extreme programming. We will just do XP, and we will do it from the start like that. So we didn't have any other setup. We didn't do anything. It was literally sat down and did what essentially is now called ping pong. Pete wrote a test. I wrote a thing that passed it. And I seem to remember the first time we did that, I literally, he wrote a test and I just returned a hard-coded thing from the method.
When you say you did XP, I mean, you're probably not doing it justice there, John, are you? Because, I mean, you were, as a business, were XP from the ground up, including the physical environment. I distinctly remember a conversation, perhaps with Tim McKinnon or somebody like that, where he talked about specially shaped desks that face people inwards to each other instead of outwards away from each other. And it was down to that level of design, wasn't it?
Yeah. No, we designed the office space to be that. I mean, we started off in what had been a garage, quite literally under Pete's flat, and there was just three of us, and then Tim joined us, was four, and we sort of grew from there. But when we moved to the office, we absolutely designed it for XP, and we were full XP, all 12 practices, fully disciplined, planning game, whole thing. And no get out clauses, or maybe we don't do it. We did all of them from the start, and we designed the office so we had stand up space, whiteboards, and our desks. Even though we were in the corners, we designed it so instead of having a right angle, there was actually a curve, so that people sat. Had a bulge out in the corner, so that was, you were looking at each other side to side and looking at the monitor. It was like a three, there was the two of you, and then the monitor was the third thing, and you would fight over the keyboard. Famously, fighting the keyboard with Ivan Moore was a devil for keeping the keyboard. But I
remember Ivan.
So we went fully committed to that principle, and it, obviously it worked for us, but in the early days it was properly like people thought we were insane. I had, interviewing people, I actually had people slam the phone down on me in interviews because they told me test driven will never work. Two people working together, no, this is not going to be, not going to be a thing. This is ridiculous. I remember one guy ranting saying,
to write the software. It's twice as long to write the software.
One guy said to me, I'll come back in 6 months and show you why you're wrong, kind of thing. And I'm still, if he's watching this podcast, I'm still waiting for him to come back and tell me why I was wrong. But and it was that. And in doing it, that's where we. So one of the things I used to say is that XP originally came from the C4 project, which was on a project which was in place, was consultants working within a corporation to produce features. And we found that actually when you're doing product, there was something different. The way we were doing product from the start, and we couldn't quite tell what it was, but we took the same principle of do it and repeat it and, examine the process as you go. And that's where we started noticing, be story driven, but there wasn't a definition or a guideline of, stories are great, why are they great? How can we make them better?
So what did those early stories look like then? I mean, was it a free-for-all? Was it a bit of the Wild West in there?
It started off sort of, I think like most people sort of do, it started describing, I want this feature kind of thing, or the system should do this, the system should do that. And my background from working in sort of some of the banks and stuff, I knew quite well that people often describe what they need in a solution, but not actually describing what the problem is. So there was that kind of thing of, it's a horseless carriage. I need a horseless carriage. It's like, you can't describe, well, what are you trying to do? I want to get from there to there without a horse. Okay, there we go. And so that's where that, as whoever you are, because, you all understood that different perspectives on the system are there. But I want this. And the so that part was that value statement. I think the original XP, I think people felt that you got sort of a card and you worked to the card, but actually generating those stories gave you a set of cards to prioritize and group, and you could actually find the problem amongst those stories. And we found that we threw more stories away than we kept, that you would refactor the stories to get to it. And I think that's where that sort of, we had that discipline of let's have some lightweight discipline about the structure and make sure we capture the key parts, and then that's now got, people have extended it to say acceptance criteria on that, which I think, makes sense. But that was it, was that, it kind of like, it was woolly enough that it was worth it, but we needed something with more discipline to make sure we could see it.
And I mean, nowadays I see stories that are entire specifications and there's a ridiculous amount of detail in them, and quite often we challenge ourselves on that. But back in the day, I mean, obviously pre-COVID particularly, but probably longer ago than that, people hadn't shifted to electronic boards and that sort of thing. So this would have all been written by hand on cards on a board, presumably. And I mean, we all miss
it's still my preferred way of doing it.
Yeah, it would be my preferred way as well, apart from remote teams. But so back in the day when you were refining and refactoring these stories, it wasn't to put more detail in. It was possibly even to leave it as lean as it possibly could be in the description, perhaps.
Well, they were true stories. Okay, so what, it's not specific. It's interesting you say specification. That people, I think, do slip into that. They were proper stories. So as a as a person wanting to book a holiday, I want to go to the system and I want to click. I want to find a flight. I want to find a hotel. I then want to choose this thing. So it was a proper long story. It wasn't just a single feature. It was probably closer to jobs to be done thinking than specification of features.
Yeah. I mean, we used to say if it doesn't fit on the back of the card, it's too much detail.
Well, in some ways, it needed to fit on the back of the card, and that forced you to not put detail in. It forced you not to say the specifics of, I want to click on this button. You want to go, I want to get a flight and book a car and book a thing, and at the end I want to do this. But that's what happened, is then that's why you had to sort of rewrite those stories, because when you started thinking about the system and the combination, you'd have the conversation with the user, or the proxy for the user, about, well, would this story be better? What if you did this? Instead of saying I want to go to this place, what if you said, and that's why you would end up rewriting the stories. And it was, but I absolutely, it was on cards, it was on the table, and actually we didn't do a lot of the design. The estimation part of the planning game was sort of rough design. Well, we could do this, we could do that, but all the real design and work of implementing it was done by the pairs when they were hands-on code. Very little design discussion in the planning at all. It was getting the stories right.
And when I mean, we'll talk about the here and now in a little while, but when people talk about replacing software development with AI, I've always been of the view that 80% of software development is nothing to do with typing in code and everything to do with the design conversation over a keyboard. And so when we get to that bit of this conversation, I'd love to know your thoughts on what AI does to that dynamic. A lot of the names you mentioned there in those early days of Connextra are names that I recognise because they were all attendees at those conferences where I met you. Do you find that that's because, did you find those people there, or did you know those people already? I know you knew some of them already, but did you know most of them already, or did you meet them there? And were they kindred spirits at those conferences? And you mentioned people thinking you're mad by wanting to go with both feet into XP. Do you find that it was only successful because you found some like-minded people? What?
I did, doing that backwards, yes. Finding like-minded people who were willing to commit to it and do it, fully, was absolutely what made it work. So a like-minded set of people who agree on a process, get it, want to try it, and are willing to know they're not right and finding a way of doing things was key to it. So very active minds, and that sort of on that wanting to make it work. So they weren't zealots, they weren't acolytes. There was nothing to follow kind of thing in that sense. We had Kent's book and we knew him. I think it was only a few. I mean, I'd come across Tim. Tim is also an inveterate small talk addict, probably more than I am. And so I'd known Tim from some of the small talk activities and the London Architecture Group. And he and Ollie.
Were you involved in the Extreme Tuesday Club in those days? Were you
living
down there?
So he. Yeah. Well, I wasn't living down there, but I'd spent time down there. So Tim
was very much at the heart of that, I think, wasn't he?
Yeah, he and Ollie set up the Extreme Tuesday.
Oh, Ollie By, that's right.
The XTC. Ollie By. Yeah, so he and then Paul Simmons. So the three of them were doing that. And then I quickly got dragged into that because basically all these things are symposiums in the true Greek sense of the word, which means we drink together. And so that's what symposium means.
I don't remember any of that in those cards. I don't remember any of that.
Oh yeah. I don't remember you drinking the whiskey. But it was very much pub based, and it was after work. You would go and we'd do these things, and it was and they'd set it up as that conversation, that kind of like, well, I'm doing this is what I'm found, and doing that. And because we'd committed to it, we'd sort of tempted Tim to come, across the line to come, and so he came in. So I knew him. I'd sort of known Ivan loosely as well, from the OT things. But then the rest of the team we built didn't know, and we recruited. For example, Tung Mak and Matt were graduates, and so they were new graduates who'd never had a job before. And we sort of said, look, we're going to do this. And they were both up for it, kind of like, great, let's give it a go. And of course, they didn't know any better. So it was useful having somebody who didn't have our legacy, to come in and ask questions. And that's one of the powers of pairing is, from my years of experience, I'd say, we'll just do this. And Tung would say, well, why? And of course, that's a terrible question to ask a senior person sometimes because you're like, I just always do it this way, And so so actually having the distance between the experience was extremely useful. I think pairing is fabulous for that because all boats rise. Even the experienced people learn, as well as the young people. Yeah. And then Rachel Davis was very interested in extreme programming and all that, wanted to get into the practice of it. But she was actually a C++ programmer. So we were working in Java. And at that time, when you were hiring people, the concept of hiring a developer to work on a code base where they didn't know the language was also insane. It was kind of like, well, you need to have the skills before you can work on the code base. And Pete and I discussed it, and we were like, well, actually, that's not true, is it? Because pairing and programming, programming is a thing, it's not syntax. So therefore, Rachel's a very good developer. She'll pick up on the language, but somebody else is going to be working with her who does know the language. And in fact, that worked really well. So Rachel came like that. Seb Palmer was an ex-documentary maker. Very little technical background, new stuff. And we brought him in because his way of thinking was different to the rest of us, and he was up for it. So it was very much trying to get a set of people who had different perspectives and thinkings and way of coming into it.
I mean, I suppose that we shouldn't be surprised by any of that because the most successful adoptions of something new usually comes from a bunch of people who really, really believe in it or are willing to be open-minded about it. It's hard to bring somebody in if they're skeptical or cynical. In the long term, that might be okay, but if you're really trying to get some new way of working off the ground, it needs real advocates of it, I think.
We learned that lesson the hard way up front. So early on, we hired a guy who had the technology background, had the technical stuff. And when Pete and I interviewed him, it was like he hasn't got the enthusiasm. He was like, I'm willing to give it a go. But then he just couldn't. He just wasn't committed to it. He couldn't get it. So we learned that we had to get people who were into the process for this particular thing, And that's where we developed the pair interview idea. So that's where pair interviewing came from. And that's the only way we would interview people was we would sit down in front of the keyboard with them and go, let's pick a story and let's write. And we would do it on the code base. And that's where it came from. It was like, get them to do the job.
Inadvertently, I heard a lot of chat when COVID struck and everybody had to go home, about whether pair programming could work remotely. And you were trialing that 25 years ago. And successfully, presumably.
Oh, to this day, it's the way I interview technologists.
Right.
Is sit down and write code with them remotely, usually, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because you listen to the way you want them to be able to talk and think and express what they're doing, and you can hear the balancing of, the trade-offs they're making as they're going and anticipating, and that's what I look for in a good developer, is someone who can do that. Experience gives them the call to be able to make good calls.
Yeah.
But you can hear, even in juniors, people who are questioning and skeptical of their own knowledge.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff, really, those early days. What an exciting time to be involved in the industry, though. So moving forward a bit then, John. So we lost touch for a couple of decades.
Yeah.
And then it was the wonderfulness of LinkedIn that actually brought us back together for a conversation, and that was nice. What's changed in 20 years? I mean, let's stay on the subject of XP for a little while, because I don't know about you may not have felt this, but I certainly felt that XP sort of fell away a little bit, fell out of favour a little bit for a period. But I'm hearing an awful lot more talk about it now again as a way of working with software. I mean, what do you think about all of that? Do you agree, or was it just that I was moving in the wrong circles, so it wasn't being talked about?
You're possibly moving in the right circles, man. But so I think people struggled with XP, and actually, funnily enough, I wrote a thing about this the other day, which is they liked the easy parts that took friction away. So let's not do big planning. Let's do stand-ups. Let's do the tests, because we understand those kind of things, but only when we need to do testing. And they picked all the parts which removed drudgery, but they didn't adopt the parts that put friction back in. That got
healthy
lost.
friction.
So like
the healthy friction.
Yeah. Friction you need. Yeah. And that's the thing, is that you need to balance that out, and that's what XP did. But people threw out the hard parts because they were hard. Oh well, pairing. Well, pairing's obviously inefficient, isn't it?
It wasn't hard. It was just a hard sell. Although I never quite understood why it was a hard sell. You had to think about the total cost of software delivery, not just the cost of typing in on the keyboard.
But it's that thing of looking in. It looks inefficient and it seems inefficient. You've got two people with one machine, and I remember Dyson, not Paul, the Hoover guy, Dyson. And I was talking to him, and we were talking about it. And he was like, "Oh, pair programming." He says, "Oh, I've heard about this." He says, "It seems very inefficient. You've got two people at one machine." And I said to him, "Well, why aren't you looking at it that you only need half the machines?" It's and sometimes
it's a good point, and it's a good point.
But it's the thing you can see and you can measure, and if you don't get this, what are you having? And this, that rapid review. I mean, this. You've pair programmed that you're getting that feedback very rapidly, and that was a lot of Kent's point. Get that feedback very rapid. Get it in there so that it's not a long time before the floor is caught. The old Toyota quality kind of idea.
And it shouldn't be a big leap for people, of course, because if people have said that about testing for a long time. The earlier you test something and trap a problem, the cheaper it is to fix. So actually, all this is doing is taking that to its logical extreme of the earliest point of catching it is when you've only just typed it in,
Yeah.
Hence
but I think that's what happened. Yeah. But I think that's what happened with it, was that with XP, it required a lot of discipline. And discipline is hard when people want to just get on and deliver. Delivering. It's like, well, what's all this stuff doing? It's not delivering customer value, but it is. It's delivering the ability to deliver value. So that can often be a difficult thing to argue.
That's one of my biggest frustrations, really, Johnny, about people's misunderstandings of agility generally, is the ones who don't like the sound of it tend to challenge on the basis of saying, well, we need the discipline that other methods bring. Agile's not disciplined and all of that. And of course, having done it and probably done it quite well, I know that it's the most disciplined way I've ever worked. It has to be. It has to be disciplined. And that's the thing that I hear most often from people who don't understand it and don't want to do it. Oh, well, you don't do any documentation. No, you do enough documentation. or you don't do any whatever, I don't know, whatever else you don't do. They say it lacks discipline. I say no, it doesn't. But there's no point creating reams and reams of documentation that'll never get looked at again.
What it does is it requires the practitioners to have discipline. You don't have a documented process. It's a practice-based, not a process-based system. Yeah. And practices require the practitioners to know which order and to be good at practices and to be able to make that judgment. So it's actually very difficult to legislate and manage with a process. And if you run into management layers who don't necessarily get that, that's where you get things, and I'm going to say it, I'll probably get slated, where you get safe and you get some of these bigger kind of things where you're trying to put in a process base around it, and it misses that fundamental that it's a practice-based approach. And practice requires discipline.
Yeah, it's a good way of looking at it, actually, because what you're doing is you're removing the things that stop the practitioners from practicing their craft, because most of those things are for somebody else's benefit. But if those other people who ask for those things, they're really asking for documentation, not because they're going to read it, but because they want some evidence to hold up that it's been done. So if you have the right people doing the work and you trust them and you believe them and they do the right thing, you don't need that evidence, and they've got more time to spend actually creating good software.
Yeah. But having a very strong practice-based thing inside required a different frame on the outside, and I think that's partly what XP got wrong. I think that that was missed, but partly because they were focusing on the right thing, which was the problem they wanted to solve. But you need a different frame on the outside of a truly disciplined XP practice than you have for a normal project, or have in a sort of a task-oriented, outcome-oriented kind of way of doing things. Yeah. And that's where a lot of people struggled, which is where that's why Scrum on the outside with XP on the inside looked attractive. And what happened, I think, was Scrum got very much adopted because it was I can see this process and it's more aligned to this kind of management thinking. Yeah. Management thinking is necessary. This isn't a criticism of it. It's about how they gel together. So I think what happened was the Scrum thing seemed to be sufficient, but the managers missed that you needed that practice discipline inside it.
But actually, it's become quite common, hasn't it, that Scrum now is the thing where people use and they say they're agile and they're doing all the ceremonies and all of that. They're not always getting all the benefits out of it, by the way, but they are doing all the ceremonies and events or whatever we're supposed to call them these days. But I don't see many teams who are then also rigorously following agile XP practices within the software development functions as well. It's all very much a bit of a free-for-all when they're writing the software, and then they come back together in the ceremonies. And I do wonder whether actually they'd be even more successful if they just had a bit of the XP rigor around the work they're doing as well. I don't see many teams pairing, for example, unless they're explicitly in the XP shop. I sometimes ask teams that I work with to consider pairing, and it doesn't often happen. Unless they're having a real problem and it needs a couple of people to break through the problem. I say, well, look, if it was easier to break through a big problem with pairing, why is it not easier to get other stuff done faster with pairing? Yeah. But I think it is a bit of a legacy of the whole two people on one computer is not as efficient as two people on two computers. Misconception.
But it comes back to that, what are you creating? And you're not just creating the software, you're not just doing the typing, you're creating the understanding, you're exploring the problem, you're designing a solution, but in designing the solution, you're finding other problems and understanding. And it is that
the knowledge
is required.
How often,
developing people.
Yeah. How often in Connextra did you have the conversation where you've got a key person dependent in somebody? I'm going to guess never.
No, I mean, that was my principle. I used to say there's the bus problem. If one person gets run over by a bus, we have a problem. Yeah. At Connextra, all I needed was one person to not be on the bus that crashed, and the rest of them could be wiped out, and it could go from there. Yeah, and that was always the principle.
I prefer the winning the lottery analogy than the bus hitting people analogy, by the way.
That's probably a nicer way of putting it.
Yeah. You don't allow your whole team to be in the same lottery syndicate.
So you asked about what else was lost along the way, and I think it was that the discipline in the practices and realizing that, and that it became this larger ceremony, like you say, of agile is Scrum, and to some extent that's true. But then even in doing that, the way I see people doing Scrum is actually just a modified form of the project manager or the product owner deciding what's going to be done next. and that discipline of practice has not been in there. It's seen as a process. You do this, then this, then this, and that takes you towards the cargo cult kind of way of doing stuff.
I mean, the very structure of ceremonies is very process led, isn't it? It's they have their templates and they meet at a regular frequency and all of that sort of thing, and you must follow this form in a retro and all of that sort of thing. I mean, that feels very process led to me, not just people getting together at the right time and talking about the right things.
So the thing I'm quite a fan of the cadence, though. I'm quite a fan of we do this day, this day, because it puts a time when we discuss those things in the diary, and you don't discuss them the rest of the time. So in fact, one of the things, it's interesting you said that. It reminds me, one of the things I think was lost was the no, not now. So when we were doing the extreme programming at that forum and in some of the other subsequent places that we did it in, it was okay to say, this is not the time, let's write it down and we'll discuss it in the planning game, or we'll discuss it, or I'll write a story down and we'll put it in the backlog and we'll come back to it. And that idea that, I'm doing this now, this is what I'm focusing on, and there is a time for that conversation, I think works. But again, that's a discipline and it's a practice. It's not a process. It's not you do this, then this, then this, and magic happens. It's knowing, it's becoming practice based and being, as a professional. To me, that's what professional creatives do. Yeah. They have good practices and they know when to do it. Yeah. And in some ways, project and program management isn't based on that. And I think that's a shame.
Yeah. Fantastic. So let's come forward in time then, John, to closer to now. So everything we've just talked about there around people working together, the creative art, if you like, of software development. I mean, that sounds a little bit pompous, doesn't it, to talk about it as an art? But there's an element of art to software delivery, I think. Yeah. Software creation. It's a creative art, a creative activity. What about AI then? So, we can see AI absolutely accelerating software developers to maybe automate some of the mundane. We've already said typing code in is the smallest part of it. So does some of the design thinking shift into prompting and all of that, and people talk about prompt engineers and all of that stuff. And but then you've got this other side of it, which is the fear that people will abandon early career developers because AIs can do just as good a job. But then where are the experienced developers coming from in the future who are going to... All of that stuff, I don't want to kill the whole conversation by mentioning all of the facets, but where's your head on all of that? What have you seen in terms of the adoption of AI into your world of software creation?
So there's no doubt it's a useful tool. Yeah, no doubt. I'm not negative about it at all. I think like any technology, and you and I have seen this over generations of technology, the same patterns occur, and it removes friction and drudgery in one place, but that means you need to put it back in another place, and we're not doing that. And I think that's a pattern we often repeat in our industry, which is we forget the lessons, that. And so I've sat down and tried to use, because I thought, right, can I sit down and work with an AI coding assistant and pair program with it? Is it possible to actually get that same feeling of pairing with one of these agents? And so far I've failed, and I've done quite a lot. I'm not a slouch with technology. I know how to write skills and prompts and do these kind of things. And that's okay, because now I've got a good intuition and a feel for what it is good at, and actually it's encouraging because it's great at doing sort of the smaller deterministic tasks much faster, but I don't want it to do, I'm not letting it just run, and there is this balance of judgment and interaction and how you work with it. So working with an AI coding assistant is not pair programming. Somebody said to me, vibe coding is just like pair programming, and it was just like no, it's not kind of thing, because there isn't the challenge, there isn't the misunderstanding, there isn't the need to communicate. They're much more erudite than we are, and so
there's no wrestling over the keyboard, John.
There's no wrestling over the keyboard. Absolutely, you can't. I think we should get Ivan Moore to train one of these up. That would be kind of interesting, which is rip the keyboard from you.
The friction point's a really interesting one. I was at a networking event in Manchester a few weeks ago, and there was a CIO there from a household name organisation. I'm not going to say who it was because we were sort of conversing openly under Chatham House rules.
Yeah.
But the sanitised version of the conversation was that they'd done some extensive proofs of concept with all sorts of different applications of AI, software development, operational automation, all that sort of thing. And the business cases that they hoped would stand up at the end of those proofs of concept came nowhere near. And actually the assessment of this person was it's largely because it took work away from some places and put work in elsewhere, which is the friction that you talk about, I think, putting the stuff back in. And it was around the checking the outputs, making sure that somebody could still be held accountable for those outputs by somebody having looked at them, all of that sort of stuff. And actually my view of it, and this is where I think, for me, the blockers to wholesale adoption of AI coding is not whether the technology is capable of writing code or not, but actually it's what jobs does it leave behind for the people who still have to do those checks. I don't know a single software developer who would happily trade the intellectual challenge of solving a problem in software to deliver a feature or whatever else. I don't know anybody who would trade that consciously and willingly for being the person who checks the output of an AI to make sure that it sort of does what it's supposed to do and then debugs it when it doesn't. I mean, that's the rubbish part of the job. The debugging and the checking. And none of us wanted to do that back in the day. I was a software developer a long time ago, before there was any real adherence to standards and information security, any of that kind of stuff. That's hard. So, our job was very much a case of, go at the code until it does what it's supposed to do, and you've checked that it does what it's supposed to do. And that was exciting and interesting, and you got a buzz when it worked. I don't remember ever getting the same buzz out of somebody coming back and saying, your software doesn't quite work. Can you fix it for me, please, before we put it live?
Yep.
And that's my worry, is that it's not a technological deficit we end up with as a consequence of this. I've got no doubt it can write code if prompted correctly. I'm worried about what it leaves behind for people who still have to check it and make it, fine-tune it to make it right, absolutely right.
But the thing is, it's you're not compounding your creativity. You're not compounding yourself there. You're not gaining anything by reviewing other people's code. You're just giving. And I think this is one of the things to watch out for, is the removal of human dignity and actuation and that creative thing, and understanding that's important to be part and doing that stuff. And that is, if you're just reviewing and checking things and applying judgment and saying yes or no, you're not adding anything. You're just gatekeeping, and it takes away the creative part of being a software engineer. Now, saying that, I think there are actually two ways of using this technology, but carry on. No,
go on. I'm interested in that. What are the two ways you see about using it?
So I think there's potentially a bifurcation in the way we can use this stuff. So one is the software for one. Just generate me the thing I need that's going to run on my environment, do my thing. I don't really care about the code quality. I don't even necessarily understand what the code's doing. And so most people who are not software engineers potentially can do that.
Is that your vibe coding, would you say? Is that kind of analogous to your vibe coding? Or
it's analogous to vibe coding, yeah. And I think this is where people, this is great, it does these kind of things. And also, to some extent, you're dealing with the risks of making those calls. Now, I think the tools have to get better and the environments have to get better to make sure consequences and security and all those kind of things work. So giving better environments for the software, for one, actually is quite empowering. You don't have to put it into a backlog of a software development team and wait 6 months for something to happen. You can get on and have something done now and have it working. So I think that's one end of the scale. I think at the other end of the scale, if you are a software engineer, a full systems developer, I think they are very useful for exploring and looking at systems and characterizing systems beyond our capability to understand. Yeah, and all this stuff about mythos and fable, being able to hack these systems and do this kind of stuff, is like Well, what that's actually showing is the system comprehension that using an AI LLM can do gives you greater reach. And if you put that visualization and understanding with the humans, you start getting there. And I've been doing this, which is I've been treating code bases as being the source of the architecture and getting the LLM to generate the architecture from the source code every time source code is checked in. Right. So there isn't a separate architecture. You look at what the architecture, what the code tells you.
Yeah, but the important thing there, I suppose, in this debate about whether the future of software development or developers is at risk is you can do that because you are an experienced, talented engineer in your own right, bringing good software discipline to that tool set. Whereas the danger is that in the first category of use is it's people who don't have that discipline feel they can produce equally good software without the discipline behind it. And I think that's the thing, is
the equally good software, but they're different systems is the point. And it's the old conversation about me, you, we, us, they. It's that kind of, if it's for me, it's one thing. If it's for you and I, there's a different set of rules. If it's for us as a group, and if it's for somebody else, and that's kind of the difference in that profession. And actually, the I software piece, accessible to people who are not programmers at all, is extremely powerful. But we have to make sure that it's couched in terms. And we need to work our way through this. All technologies, especially digital, have been bifurcating and dumbbelling all the time. I mean, I wrote compilers in the 1980s. I couldn't sit down and write one now. I haven't written one. I use them. In fact, I probably haven't used a compiler in a long time.
but you don't need to. But you don't need to. But
it compounds.
The slightly less sophisticated way I think about the vibe coding is I can't back this up with data. This is just my subjective perception, but I don't think I've seen a single success story declared around vibe coding that wasn't a single requirement stakeholder, well-bounded, small-scale application, an app, if you like.
Yep.
I've seen plenty of people claiming to have done those, and I don't doubt that they have, actually. I imagine they have. Maybe a utility app or something like that. But I don't see very many. I haven't seen anybody yet claiming enterprise scale software success with delegating software development entirely to a tool. AI coding, definitely. I'm seeing people claiming 20, 30% efficiency, acceleration around coding with Assistant. And I can believe that because I believe some of the people who've said it to me. But certainly not complete standalone systems or applications. I haven't seen a single person claiming success in enterprise scale yet.
I haven't seen enterprise scale, I must admit. I've seen websites and systems that are used by hundreds of people being done in that way. But again, very closed and specific applications, and I don't think that's a problem. I think the need to have a user interface on a service is almost pointless now. Let other people, have good APIs on a service and let them integrate it into their own workflows and user interfaces. It's almost that, which is, I think, where a lot of SaaS companies are getting into that. What's our defendable defense AI moat kind of thing. That whole conversation, which is, why would you produce a UI on a service anymore? Your specialization is in the back-end service. But I haven't seen a lot of very complex back-end services developed in vibe coding, because I think it's understanding the problem requires that conversation. And the iteration,
actually, John, I think, it's very hard, I think, to write a prompt for something incredibly complex and get it right the first time. You have to iterate. And I still believe the best place to fix software that doesn't quite work correctly is directly in the code, not by minutely iterating a prompt that you thought might have been right in the first instance to try and get it to land on the correct behavior second, third, fourth, fifth time. I think that's potentially a mind-numbing job for somebody to have to iterate prompt.
I also think it sort of ignores how LLMs actually work. Just because you're getting your prompts, you run your prompt 7 times, you might get 7 different answers. And if you're trying to constrain the model, as soon as they release another model with different weights, you're going to get a different code generator.
Well, I read a really interesting thing this morning on LinkedIn. chap called Chris Gullick, who I worked with once in a startup 10 years ago, maybe. He works in the data and AI space, and he was describing the, and I still don't understand it fully. I don't need to. I won't pretend to. But he was describing how tokens work and how the probabilistic nature of LLMs is, and all of that. And I get all of that at a level of detail, but he obviously understands it better than I do. But he was saying, his article was actually about whether we're killing the planet by saying please and thank you in your prompt, because it's more tokens and it's more power. And he did some maths around it and scaled it and all of that. But actually the more interesting thing was the absence or presence of a please and a thank you just changes the prompt.
Yep.
So he said it's virtually mathematically impossible to get the same output from two very subtly different prompts, because all it's doing is deciding what's the probability of the next token representing a particular word in the response. And if you have please and thank you in there, it just changes the prompt for better or for worse.
Yeah.
He said the anecdotal evidence is that if you put please and thank you in, you'll get a longer response. But he said even that's just kind of, I think he was saying that's just largely anecdotal evidence. But the balance, I think one of his conclusions was actually that the please and thank you in your prompt probably doesn't have that much bearing on the overall cost of power and all of that stuff for serving that response, because the responses are always significantly larger than the prompts anyway.
They will have an effect, because the thing to remember about LLMs is they're entirely deterministic all the way through in the statistical process, except for the bit right at the end, which is just a bit of choosing between options. So that's how it works. So there's always going to be that random choice, and what happens is, for a given prompt, you'll get a set of answers within that given possible set. But if you do put please and thank you in, I can see why the question's there, because you're then going to be firing the language which is much more polite in response. It's like if you say to it, talk like a pirate, you give answers like a pirate, it talks like a pirate, right? And it's generating things like that. So the question is, you want it to be like a grumpy old developer like me who's just going to give you the one-word answer. And in fact, I've done that to say, be curt, be short, be whatever.
I've done that as well. I have on occasion said, for the rest of this chat, please don't show your workings, just give me the answers.
Yeah.
Because I've just needed to get some numbers out or something. I don't know. I can't remember what now. But I did for a while wonder whether it would mirror or learn my tone of voice, and so if I was polite to it, it would mirror that in its responses. I don't know whether there's any evidence for that, but that was my excuse.
It will because the context. Remember, the whole of the context goes. So if you're being polite in a context, it goes, and it will use that because it generates structure of language based on structures it's seen. So if it's seen polite conversations, it will structure polite conversations.
Right.
So the question would be.
I'm glad you've endorsed that view, John, because I was beginning to wonder whether I was being a bit daft thinking like that. Because when people say, "Oh, you should be polite to the AI because when it takes over the world, you might not be the first one it comes and kills," and I'm saying, well, no, there's
good news.
There's a better reason for being polite. Is that it's just I have to do less work with the responses it gives me if they're already framed reasonably politely.
Yeah, the good news is it doesn't remember. So it's not going to remember that stuff. It's probably more what you're saying on LinkedIn, which is what's going to be used as evidence against you when the AI courts come out. The hanging AI comes out, kind of thing. But yeah.
So great, John. That's all fantastic stuff. We're sort of moving towards the end of wrapping up. A couple of extra things just to finish on. So if you were going to come in full circle, if you like, if you were going to do Connextra today, would you? And what would you do differently, if anything?
Let's say it's a similar product, because the idea of the product is different. But doing a startup today, would I do anything differently? I definitely find two other people who are into it. I think having three to start as founders is good, because
three
two of you agree.
Yeah.
Two agree and one says no is a good way of being able to go through conversations. Because if you're both at loggerheads, it's hard to resolve what a third helps.
Or, of course, if you both agree with each other too readily, you might miss something.
Precisely. So it's exactly that. So I would do that again. Three to start is definitely there. I would do XP, absolutely. I'm interested in how XP, people working with XP with AI coding assistance works. So actually, I've tried to line a couple of sessions up with some people I know to actually do XP with them, but with AI coding assistance, because I think that will change the dynamic. So I'd be interested to see what that looks like.
A pair and an AI coding assistant.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
A pair and an AI coding assistant, because I think that will produce, that will be different, and it'll change the friction again, and it actually might give too much time to be discussing things while the AI is writing code. So so I definitely would use get AI in those processes as and apply it. So I definitely would do that. I think it's a lot easier these days to deploy and get things out there and get them working. So deploy as soon as possible. We, at the time I was doing Connextra, we still had our own infrastructure, so we had to do all that.
Yeah.
But with cloud and various deploys. So yeah, I think I would still 3 and XP definitely would be the way to approaching it. I wouldn't vibe code and then think this is a great product, let's turn this into something. I'd go with the blank slate.
Yeah. Would you use vibe coding for spikes and proofs of concept and trying to articulate what it is you're going to try and build, that sort of thing? Do you think it's got a place there?
Yes, I think there's a place for spiking in that kind of thing. But the whole point in spiking was you throw it away.
Yes.
And one of the things we did was one of the practices we put in place was gold cards. The gold card in extreme programming.
I remember those.
You could get out of the discipline. It was basically, I'm not going to pair. I've got an idea. I just want to go and play with it.
And had a certain number to play each period of time, didn't they?
So each month you had 2 cards you could play. And you could play it at any time. At stand-up, I'm just playing my gold card, because we swapped pairs all the time. Yeah. And I think that's also an important thing to put in, which is allow your team to have space to go and explore and come back and report. So not be in the we had a problem at Connextra, which is where the gold cards came from. It's that we were doing XP with such discipline, such regularity, that it's what Tim McKinnon said, we got Catholic guilt. We became guilty if we weren't doing it, and it was producing tension. And it was the wrong kind of friction.
Yeah.
And we had this sort of a blow-up session where we all just wrote problems down on cards and put it down and sorted them on the table, which is another reason why cards are good, because it gets it out of the person and into a shared space.
Yeah.
And when we refactored that, on the table, it was like there was this thing that we just didn't get that creative, that opportunity to be creative individually, to just try something and do it. And actually that's where it came from. So putting space in, and that's where I would agree with you, where I think vibe coding is good for spiking and doing. And actually I think it's quite good for actually doing an interactive story that you can actually get someone to give you. So that, I want, here's a demonstrator so that I do this, so that your card.
What a good thought, yeah. Because actually,
I've seen that work quite well. Actually, so instead of having them,
a well-written prompt could look like a user story, actually, to some degree, couldn't it, or vice versa?
Or could generate the interface. Could generate a working example.
And then you
write
say
me a demo which does this.
And you say to you say to the requester, if it was a bit like this, would it in the right direction? Because we used to do paper prototypes and stuff to do that sort of thing, didn't we?
But I think this is what potentially vibe coding gets rid of the paper prototypes.
Yeah.
And you don't need a developer to do it. You can ask your requester, and the requester can use the tool to generate the thing they want by doing.
I'd like something a bit like this, please.
So it's almost like that. I was saying the software for one. I would like something like this. Can you now make that available to everybody else, please? It's that kind of thing. So. So definitely, I would do it again. Do 3, do pair programming, put the Slack in with the gold cards, use vibe coding for spiking, but throw it away. Don't just take a spike and try and turn it in, because you have to layer all those decisions and trade-offs. And getting an AI to do that, the AI isn't doing trade-offs; it's generating streams, and then you have to look at what the implied trade-offs are. And we get back to that point we were making before. Just reviewing that is painful. So use it for construction of the thing you want, but make sure you're doing the trade-offs.
One last thing then, John, because we've talked a lot about what's changed over the last 25 years since you and I last spent time together materially. What hasn't changed? What's changed? What stayed the same? Looking at software development over those 2 to 3 decades, what actually is the same now as it was then, would you say?
or I'll be deeply philosophical about this now. This is I'm an old man in my dotage, so I'm going to be doing philosophy. So I think the thing that hasn't changed is our hubris as technologists. We just do the same thing repeatedly. It's an incredible thing we do. That technology changes power. It restructures who can do what, who can't do what, who wins, who loses. But we as technologists sort of don't really appreciate that. That's our power, and I don't think we take that importantly enough and build enough time in to reflect and think about the secondary effects and the consequences. And if it is showing something bad, how do we step back? We've seen that repeatedly. We saw it with objects. We saw it very much with social media. We're seeing it with AI, where the benefits come quickly and the costs come slowly and are massive. But we don't balance that off. So I think we haven't figured out how to do that stuff. And for all the AI governance or policies or ethics frameworks, that's not a practical way of doing it. It has to be built into going back to what we were saying before, our discipline as technologists. It's our practices where we have to build that in, and we just haven't done that somehow. I know lots of individuals who are good at it, and I think thankfully there's people who have the principles, but I think that thing remains the same, which is we rush at the value and the benefit, and we don't spend enough time stepping back and thinking. And I think you're seeing some of that with the AI and the vibe coding. People are reflecting on it and going, well, this isn't as good as it was, doing the pilots, like you say, and saying this isn't got the payoff. And that's good. Taking that measured approach and the pilots and experimentation is important. But we have to, I think the thing we haven't changed is that ability to reflect and think about the power change. You don't have to predict it, but we do need to put the mechanisms in place in order to spot when it's going wrong and do it. It's like cybersecurity. Cybersecurity you do by making sure you can spot when something goes wrong and limits the blast radius. We don't do that when we develop code. We still don't do it. And I think that's the thing that remains the same. If there was one thing I could fix, it would probably be that.
Right. Fantastic. Listen, John, we're out of time. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'm really pleased we've reconnected and had some of these conversations, because back in the day, you were somebody in those conferences that I really looked up to, because you were already a good decade into your career by then. And I mean, long may the conversations continue, John. And thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you for the invite and good questions, Matt. You know what I'm like. But I do my best thinking in an argument with a person, I must admit, and that's why XTC and OT were always in the pub, because that also helps.
Well, yes, but, I mean, the early days of the OT conferences in Cambridge, with the cast of Harry Potter alongside of us, was some of the best nights out I remember in my early career.
That's a different story. That's a dangle at the end of the podcast for people to ask questions about, isn't it?
That's episode 2, definitely.
That's episode 2, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you for your time. Thanks
a
you,
lot,
Matt.
John.
That was great.
Talk to you soon. Bye now. Bye-bye.